Agent is like a 4-year-old kid. And if you give your credit card to your agent or PII to the agent, it took only like a few seconds for a malicious merchant to break this agent and get your credit card information or this PII information.
Identity in some way is the very beginning of the agentic workflow if you already have an agent. And payments is the very end of an agentic workflow. But then in the end of the day, if the middle doesn't work, then neither of them will have a real adoption.
Also, the guardrail is like before the execution where whichever decision the agent is making or the foundation model is making, it never flipped out of the control or out of the original mandate or original intent of the user. Hi everyone, welcome to the episode 4 of our Hubble podcast series. Today we have both co-founders of Kite AI, Chi and Scott, here on the stage. And if you guys want to introduce yourself and what is Kite currently working on and how you guys fit into this space and how you guys envision where the space is going. Chi, if you want to start.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us, Nathan. And exciting to share the vision and what we are doing at Kite. A little bit about myself. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kite. And before that, was coming more from the AI and big data background. Did my PhD at Berkeley. This is where we're alumni there. And then after that, so founding member of AI startup that work on automated machine learning platforms. I'm doing product management at Databricks for data engineering products. And at Kite, we're building infrastructure for agentic payments and governance, meaning that we really think in the future when agents are the dominant actors on the internet, there need to be a more native infrastructure to enable them to collaborate with each other and talk, even pay services to each other. That actually require a holistic unit of infrastructure and middleware to enable that way beyond payment itself. So that's the part. I know that later on today, we'll dig into the identity, passport, a bunch of other topics that we can then expand from there.
Scott, if you want to.
Yeah, I'm Scott. I'm co-founder and CTO of Kite AI. I've been data and AI infrastructure for last 15 years in SF, spent 4 years in Salesforce, spent 4 years at Uber and open source streaming DB company before this one. Like since earlier this year, Agent has become very powerful in terms of execution, task, and coding. But this is actually more like a hypothesis when we start pivot to Kite like a year and a half ago. So that's why I'm more excited in the future. I think in the next few months, coding agent going to replace majority of developer work, like the fundamental paradigm shift for developer. And this requires tons of interaction. But we are actually exploring a Kite Passport for developer use case as well. We're going to release in a month or so. Kite is building for developer, for user, for agent. Happy to explore more about it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms, because you mentioned about the agent passport, right? The building for developers, and one level up of that topic is actually on the know your agent, quote unquote KYA. So in this generation, an agent start operating not just the money, but everything in general. Knowing the identity of the agent and having consistent access and control of the agent is critical. Do you mind both of you sharing the thought process of where this idea is initiated and like what are the current method, or is there ever like existing method to KYA, and what's new on like agent passport?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The idea initiated for last 70 years. The whole computer follows this more like a punch machine. So I think the paradigm for the computer before Gen AI is that computer is like a more complex calculator. So you just give them a list of programmable instructions, follow the instruction, do the calculation. But for the first time since Gen AI, first is it brings the threshold as a pass the Turing test. Now you not only can use computer as a bigger version of calculator, but you can also use computer as a neutral network, like a smart intelligence individual to help you to answer all kinds of questions. It may not reach a domain expert level, but it reach medium level. For certain domain, it may actually much smarter than average expert. For example, for programming, for coding, it's already reached a very high level. Even the most sophisticated infrastructure engineer are going to use AI almost like 24/7. It replaced majority of the tedious engineering work. So I think for the first time, we have a very paradigm shift different than the last 70 years of computer and computer science. And then if we're going to have an individual intelligence agent doing the work for you, you need delegation, you need ID. Otherwise, the agent is living in a miserable state. They don't have ID. They don't have authentication, authorization. They cannot act on behalf of user, no matter it's developer or consumer. And activity is not distinguished from user. So you're going to see painful interaction between both parties. Like from merchant side, you have tons of the high frequent interaction, which seems much higher probability of fraud and cause troubles in merchant. No matter the merchant is an Amazon merchant, API merchant, or infrastructure provider. From consumer side, you have to impersonate the agent as user itself to bypass this capture KYC process. Basically, you just impersonate the agent as a human to do the work. I think it's painful in the both. Then the trend is already happening. Real traffic going to be AI agent. For example, Stripe Sessions Meet conference. Starting from a year ago, it's roughly 0% agent is visiting their website. Up forward to today, 40% or 50% of the traffic is actually coming from coding agent instead of humans. This is going to be even growing faster. I think in the near future, almost every single visit to the developer doc website are going to be the coding agent or agent, not going to be human. It's already happening, but agents still don't have ID authentication and the activities with user and delegation. And that's why, we work on this and we start this.
I think Scott shared a lot of like the initial rationale about why we started Kite, particularly why we think agent identity and the passport design around like a delegation permission is very critical in the beginning to us. So maybe I'll add a little bit more context to share why now we think developer-oriented use case becomes super interesting. Nowadays, coding agents become super powerful and popular. So it's not only the original developers are using a coding agent to build solutions, to build software, build app. Nowadays, what we see is a lot of even non-technical people, quote unquote, vibe coder. And obviously, there's also some vibe coder that's upgraded to become like a SAMI developer that's seriously trying to turn their solutions and apps into something that's monetizable and can be used by other people, has been shown up and grown very, very quickly over the last year. That's also reflected to the hyper success of coding platforms, or particular vibe coding platforms like Lovable and Replit, which means moving forward, we're only going to see more and more people build agents and build apps that are building by those agents in the next year. Recently, there's a few inference company we talked to. ARR growth is actually like 20, 30 times. That is, they never seen before, which is reflected by the coding agents and, like Agentic workflows that's been very quickly growth over the last year, meaning that identity and delegation will be further more important because of this market trend. As you can imagine that first, you will have a lot of agent or apps that need to access and use different type of services for making the workflow work. Meaning that how do you govern and control this agent and app to use those services become a big challenge or become a big need. That at least that's the bare minimum to say that. That's why this type of governance solution becomes super critical. How do you give the access to the API key control? How do you give what's the time window of access to those services? How do you pay them? How do you bill those services to the end user if you want to monetize this agent or app? That's the very beginning of this needs. And then moving forward, if you are even have agent to collaborate with other agents, that's further will complicate this whole flow. That's why, it's a really makes sense what we believe in and bet on when we launched the Kite for like this whole stack of identity governance to payments to make agentic workflow work become a lot more critical over the last few months. The growth of the agentic workflow has been crazy.
I can definitely echo on both of your observation on the market, because first one is definitely a little bit off the topic for the mainstream when you're mentioning about the inferences, right? Because one of our growth is actually on those data centers and the energy providers as well as those like electricity market, because basically our guardrail can provide them trustworthy high frequency load rebalancing, order matching for all of their like machines or like rentals and stuff, because inference costs are continuous but relatively low, but like training costs are like spikes but relatively short. So they really need to do a very fast load balancing between different vendors, like hardware providers, GPU providers, and so on and so forth. That's a little bit more similar to quote unquote the market maker process, right? In general, when we're talking about the trading. But definitely we agree to what you have observed regarding how the inference market is increasing. And that's where coding agents start to get blossom. So basically what we build is definitely on your downstream, right? More on the pre-execution control. And I'm actually curious what you observe between where agents start doing these suggestions and giving out like plans for those non-programmers, especially for like Cloud Cowork, for instance, right? There are a lot of marketing people or salesperson. They start to use Cloud Cowork to manage their CRM, to manage all of them. So beyond the whole trading concept or beyond the whole like finance concept, right? I think probably you guys will also have an opinion the entire KYA process will be useful for non-financial AI workflows in general. If you want to continue on that topic.
That actually is right to our rally because recently a lot of the traffic or use cases we have observed and worked with people are now financial related. Even for non-financial use cases, QIA still matters a lot. A concrete example that you can think of is when you are using Cowork to do the marketing related use case, CRM management, a marketing campaign, and help you to reply to your customers and social media content kind of drafting and everything. So then underlying that still require a lot of like the third party services to make this thing happen. For example, no matter if you're building your own or using your own marketing agent or using Cloud Code Cowork to do the marketing campaign, very likely you will use some solution underlying like Twilio API service for you to automatically send out the email or send out the text or like a different format to people. Then from that perspective, if you don't have a good process to manage this Twilio API or Twilio account creation, login, and API credential creation and management, then basically you have to do all those things manually by yourself as a developer or as a marketing person. Even if you don't know how to code, but probably like with guidance of Cloud, you can still like follow the steps and everything one by one, right? So from that perspective, then that's still a manual process you have to do, unless you grant of the access control to your Cloud Code so that they can operate on Chrome as a browser operation and everything. But in the end of the day, there's still some login process, everything that they will ask human to come in and say, hey, you have to create password and everything. And then I can continue the browser operation on behalf of you. But the whole point here to say is without a good KYA / like identity process built in, then it still require a lot of a human in the loop to make this whole process happen. But if you're using Kite Passport and also, of course, some other solutions you can use in the market, then you don't need to actually worry if I'm using a Cowork workflow or like building my own app using coding agent and the Twilio API or Twilio account is just one of them, but maybe underlying it's like require 10 or like 20 accounts, 20 services to make this whole flow work. Then you have to basically do that one by yourself every time when you want to spin up a new task for that. So I think that is particularly one of the concrete demand we observed why people would be interested using identity access, because identity essentially what we are enabling those users for is for auth in the process. And I believe Scott can add more there for what is the technical capability that's really need to enable to help user to not every time need to be in the loop as human.
That's something that I want to follow up as well, because those use cases are specifically for non-coders, right? Because like if you're a software engineer or you have some of the like computer science background, you definitely know that okay, there shouldn't be like mission critical access control that you should directly give to, for instance, Cloud Cowork, right, or like Cloud Code. But for people who don't have a coding background, they just don't know what they don't know. So they might just like given up their critical information. I've seen people giving up their social securities, right? I've seen people giving up their PIs to the coding agents or to whatever quote unquote agent that they get from the marketplace, right? So that's definitely quite dangerous. And the second observation that I can also echo to what your response is, because when we are onboarding completely traditional customers, they don't really care what and how the specific, how AI works. Right. For instance, when they're setting up the guardrails, when they're setting up their policies, they do it in a natural language. And when AI translated for them and they need to check like one by one, this is what I want, and they click yes, right? They click confirm or they click revise. So like question for Scott would be from technical perspective, how those non-programmers or people are not familiar with AI at all, how do they know identity is actually confirmed? And well, how would they know that they are always in control of their agent? It's not like, okay, I'm using the agent, but it's actually from a phishing website, right? When I'm using that agent, but it's somehow the credential has been shared to someone else.
It's actually many questions. It's not only about KYA, but also about credential sharing, even privacy compliance. Let's actually break down first is ID. How do you ping an agent ID? And then how do you do KYA? And from agent ID, we can know, because the ID part is actually for more about behavior. The reason we want to ping the ID is that we want to lower the trust cost to make transactions. So then we can talk about agent behavior. Then it's about agent sharing its credential to the merchant. I think it's a three question. So even though it don't have agreement, but I feel the industry is leaning towards agent ID is composite of three IDs. First is user ID. For example, who is actually behind this agent? Where is this user coming from? What's the user behavior before? What's the user credit score? The user ID is who is the user behind it. You may have some agent represents a company, business entity. That's business entity will represent the reputation for agent as well. That's a user ID. Second is that you need to have a model ID. Like, am I using Opus? Am I using ChatGPT? The model ID is very critical. All the model is random. If there is some weird behavior, for example, it happened in the past, the model recommended user to send transaction to a spammer account because when it gets trained, the training data got polluted to a spammer account. It sent a transaction to a spammer account on Solana. That happens a year ago. So in this case, you need to pin the model ID and figure out what model version you are using. And then you need to pin to the harness ID as well, because the cloud code will be very different behavior than codec. There is actually tons of the behavior difference between cloud code, codecs, Pi framework, OpenCloud, Hermes. Each of them are very different. They use different philosophy. They have different logic. If combine this is identify them as a different agent. Then on top of it, people don't spoke about it, but sometimes you need to probably ping with a runtime ID. The runtime ID, for example, Docker ID. What's a Docker ID you run in the AWS? What's your machine ID? For example, if you run this cloud code in your local machine. So the agent ID actually ping to full component. User ID, model ID, agent harness ID, and then runtime ID. So the full ID will define what agent it is. That's the agent ID part. And then the agent behavior can only be decided after all this ID ping together. Second part is that what information you disclose to the merchant. Sometimes we are joking, agent is like a 4-year-old kid. And if you give your credit card to your agent or PI to the agent, it took only like a few seconds for malicious merchant to break this agent and get your credit card information or this PI information. So I think that's actually more like a know your business part, KYB part. For example, Amazon haven't done this yet, but if Amazon support merchant for agent, they either need to do the KYB for their merchant, or they need to add some mechanism to preventing the merchant doing something evil. Because the merchant for human most likely will be a little bit different than merchant for agent. Because the interaction is come from agent, you need a much lightweight and much more frequent interaction dispute process. I think that's very different as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what we help both Ondo and Solana do in terms of like access and control, as well as policy control over, let's say, like who can buy USDY, right? Who can mint USDY, who can trade over USDY and run strategy over it, right? Because those are all the behavior. And those are very like compliance heavy company. And they do have geolocation restrictions. They do have KYB, KYC requirement. And also they're very strict over the entire minting process and whatsoever. So this is exactly echoing to what Scott just mentioned about they need to know who is operating on their system and who is behind those agents who are operating on their system. Consistency actually matters as well. This is definitely the comfort zone of Scott because he mentioned a lot of things that are very developer friendly, but probably not technical friendly. Next question for G is more on the business side or on the high level conceptual side, right? Because when we actually mentioned about the identity of the agents, or the identity of the entire multi-agent workflow, right? Can an agent be trusted in one context, but restricted in another? That's more on the operation side first. And second, once we know who an agent is and how that penetration go from the user or the business all the way to the agent, is identity enough, or what else do people or the downstream should take care of?
That's a very good question. That actually goes to what recently we have spent a lot of time discussing internally about our go-to-market, because the short answer is definitely not enough. Just to make this a very open discussion and very honest about our observation in the market, right? I think there's a few wake-up moments to us over the last 6 months that a lot of things that we initially thought they're not wrong, but they're certainly not gonna be only enough by themselves to solve customers' problem. And that's not only goes to identity, that also goes to payment. Because if you really think about that, identity in some way is the very beginning of the agentic workflow if you already have an agent. And payments is the very end of an agentic workflow. But then in the end of the day, if the middle doesn't work, then neither of them will have a real adoption. So that's why I think this is definitely like a few wake up conversations or like observations once we observed how our customer are using our solution for. Very simple example, just about, like our focus recently about the company and customers. We talked about consumer. General payments for consumers use case is very sexy and relatable. But if you really start like working with customers, trying to solve their like shopping use case or like a travel booking type of a use needs, then you observe there's actually a lot of additional gap on top of that to actually, like even make them hit the payment step. They cannot find the right product they want. So I think that's why there's a lot of like when double in details when you come to the real world use cases you observed, it's not enough. However, one thing that I do want to add here is one thing we observed actually for particular some user persona or some use cases, if we can add something that's short term, it's actually will make it work. What does that mean is, give you a concrete example, is we again spend a lot of time talking about developers. And I think not only because obviously Scott is coming from developer background, but I'm not a developer. Recently, I'm so excited about like coding agents make development so easy and almost hand-free. To a lot of the work. So that means for developer use case or for developer demands, that's real. Then from that perspective, what can we do from identity and payments perspective to enable developers? Or let's put it in another way. What is the thing that developers care about to actually adopt identity and payment in order for them to care and in order for them to march towards that step is actually then particular needs we observed is people want to like further management on deployment and also like the later on like management of the workflow and app they're building, right? So if you are a developer, what you usually will say is, oh, you developed a prototype or like a MVP in a sandbox environment. And then you have to turn this development into production once you are ready, once you want to let the other people to use that. But nowadays, Cloud Code or other coding agents really solve the development part very well. Of course, there's still some gap and some improvement need to be done, but the majority of the work has really been put into development process. But how about the rest of the process? Where is the deployment hand-holding? Where is the management hand-holding? And particularly when it comes to management, is we briefly touched about this, like who is going to help them to hook all the services that the app or like the agent workflow they build using Cloud Code to access, to manage, and also again, make sure the credential is not leaked, is not accessed by other people. And also who is going to help them to pay for those services. And the payment itself could be just a monthly, but also you could turn that into be more streaming and, just a per API call type of solutions. Obviously, that is what X42 or like other payment protocol that's now pushing. And by the way, I think Cloudflare today just made an announcement that nowadays all the APIs and the services that's behind Cloudflare can turn themselves into API, like the micro payments, basically like an API call type of a payment using X42. But in order for people to hit there, you have to help them to be further take care of like the deployment and management side so that they can be felt freely to pay for those services. And of course, like similarly for identity itself help you to control. But why you want identity to control is because your agentic workflow, your agentic app start really working. So you want to control that. And then that is the gap we see that not only in the market that exists, but also for us, Kite, to push our Kite Passport adoption, our existing products adoption. We have to build some additional features to close this gap so that we can make developers to really adopt our product.
That's also one of the purposes of this entire podcast series is for taking the action of educating the market. Because developers definitely take the step forward because they are using Cloud Code every day. They're using Codex every day, right? And training people, they take a step forward because they have seen like the power of AI making the upgrade from the role-based trading to the principle-based trading. So those two groups of people are definitely, the fast one leaping forward. But as both of us mentioned, right, if you really get your hand dirty in facing those like very traditional industry who only know the concept of AI or mostly using AI as, like ChatGPT, right? Just like chatting with them and try to get some help. So there are a lot of like invisible gaps and there are a lot of educational like burden. Probably all of those like AI infrastructure builders and product builders need to come across and come over that hurdle. So echoing back to what Scott just mentioned about like the potential risks and the pollution, so because you mentioned about data pollution while the model is being trained, right? You also mentioned about like the inconsistency between agents start collaborating together and some of them are just something's not clicking, right? So on the more friendly way of saying this, like when agent interact with, let's say, approve agent but wrong action problem before the final decision, like in general, because I don't really want to say quote unquote settlement because that's definitely restricted to the financial use cases, but more in general, like their decision making or like approval or the execution of that decision. How do you prevent the inconsistency between what you have approved your agent to do is not actually what the agent like finally delivered?
Yeah, so that's a hard part. So like what's the user intent in this case could be very ambiguous in this case. For example, when you delegate the agent to do something as a user, it has so many possibilities. It can interpret things in option A, it can interpret things in option B. But I think what I found today is that when agent has uncertainty, this is actually programmable. When agent has uncertainty, it will prompt the cloud code and say, hey, we need further user input. So you can prompt cloud code, you can even call the cloud code corresponding endpoint and say, we need a further clarification from user before we move forward. I don't think this problem can be solved without deeper integration with agent harness. And also case by case, ambiguity may be different. Sometimes could make costly mistake. But at the end of the day, as the more we think about this, particularly from my side, I feel like it should be deeply embedded in the harness process and deeply related to the version of the model as well.
I definitely agree because one metaphor that I always make to like people who are not like deeply integrated into AI is the entire engineering system design in this quote unquote agentic workflow is just like a human vertebrae, right? You have some part that is invariant, like and not changeable or quote unquote decisive. The foundation model part or the quote unquote decision making process are flexible. They are quote unquote free, more intelligent, and give you more possibilities, right? And you control those like non-deterministic part by a deterministic part. Like definitely identity passport, definitely on the very top, right? Where you make sure that even before you enter the system, you always have the right, consistent, direct control of your agent, right? Also, the guardrail is like before the execution, where whichever decision the agent is making or the foundation model is making, it never flip out of the control or out of the original mandate or original intent of the user. Definitely, that's the hard part. And more on the higher level, because we're approaching the end of the program, continue with that. What should the future, like, quote unquote, agent native stack look like? Especially because echoing back to your experience in Databricks, I think the professor recently published a paper over the efficiency and the accuracy of the multi-agent system workflow, right? It's almost like 50% or even less than 50% of accuracy. So I'm just curious about like both of your input on like what's the future of like multi-agent system like workflow is going to look like, and how like different layers of control and different layers of guardrails are going to play in this entire process.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. When it comes to accuracy, to be frank, I don't know what's people's definition about multi-agent workflow or like orchestration nowadays, because I felt there's a different definitions. To me, now, I just to share my like personal experience here. When I'm using Cloud Code to build an app or build a product, I think by just leveraging skill like a superpower, underlying, they actually spin off and orchestrate a lot of agents in a pretty decent manner to help me go through each of the product module and build that. And if that is what we are referring to multi-agent system orchestration, I already felt a lot of like a good output from that. And overall, of course, there's like iterations that they have to have like the reviewer to review the implementer's code, only the code quality, but also the spec match level and everything. And there's might be a few iterations. Also, that's the probably like where the concept of a loop engineering over the last few months has become super popular. And that's could be meaning that the more loop you do, you probably indeed burn a lot of token. But in the end of the day, to me, I felt the result come back is pretty decent. At least based on like what I need from that. I felt it's already give me a very, I would say like 95% of the product quality I want, certainly about 80%. So if this is like the, again, multi-agent orchestration, I felt it's actually worked for me. But obviously, what I heard from other friends, when they really want to treating each of the agents as employee to them. For example, Anthropic recently had this manage the platform. And obviously then, because this Monday, internally in one of our all hands meeting, where we're talking about some of the things we want to do in-house. But the point is then we're like, go out to ask some people who are using those type of, even like to manage the platform. Then the feedback from them is still, if you want to harness and orchestrate like multiple agents and treating them really as a serious like a teammates and employee to them, then there's still a lot of gap of the accuracy and the repetitive kind of like a workflow retry they did and cannot hit the results. So to me, I think from a practical perspective, really depends on what type of use cases you're using a multi-agent system for. And if it's just like having them spin as a temporary agent to work on a specific task, the experience I have right now is pretty good. But maybe if you're treating them as a long-living teammates and employee, or even like a buyer and seller in the future to negotiate with them, what I heard from the market is still there's a big gap. But obviously, like I personally have not had the experience that. So cannot comment too much on that.
I essentially have the same experience, right? If I am the orchestrator myself, I'm orchestrating like each of the agent and let them do the work that I want them to do, right? They're able to do it well. But if I really let them talk to each other and try to say, okay, if agent A is passing on some work directly to agent B without going through me, that's when things popped up. Right, that's where shit hits the fan. Right, so that's essentially like a waste of time. Right, that's on the opposite.
Yeah, actually, I think it's very possible, like you mentioned. Probably the reason so far I have not experienced that is in some way coding agent themselves is a very templated process. So whenever you spin up those agents, the overall flow is always like planner, implementer, and reviewer. So it's like the loop of that. So that's why from the coding or like a development perspective, I think it's a very kind of like a logical and well-designed framework for agents to work with each other. So that's why it's
Yes.
less likely for them to go crazy.
Scott, what's your thought on this?
The key part is, we find the right flow or mechanism or workflow to solve user problem. It don't really matter if it's agent to agent. It don't really matter, what type of workflow you're using. AI democratize this intelligence part, make the margin cost for intelligence almost zero. So that's why I think we're probably not very far away from an easy to use product for developer, but we're very far away from easy to use product for consumer. So at the end of the day, it just help you solve the problem. And then no matter the problem is research, handle a tedious task, what type of problem it is, it just use intelligence at a margin cost almost equal to zero to help you solve a problem and give you a solution. I think that's actually what matters. And then in terms of a workflow, it may evolve and then it may change, for example, she mentioned coding agent is plan, implement, and review. That may change. The spec-driven development is something relatively new. It's not you have many different paradigm, different approach for this, test-driven development, spec-driven development. It may be replaced in the future for different patterns. It don't really matter. At the end of the day, you want to solve the problem. Focus on problem solving, focus on solution given by AI agent. I think that's probably more important.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I totally agree with what you observed, because for all of those quote unquote new progress or a recent update of the entire a coding process, right? Like how people even construct the coding problem, using AI agents. It turns a little bit harder for me to follow, because every single day there are some new stuff going on, and when you adopt to that quote unquote newest stack, there are going to be something else popping up, probably some random Twitter that get 20,000 of stars on GitHub and saying that, okay, this might be a better skill. I mean, it is a great discussion with both of you. Those are the problems that this entire industry really needs to think through, because people are hyped about the entire payment process, right? Like agent handling the payment, agent handling the money, agent handling the entire workflow. They're just saying that, okay, we're replacing A, we're replacing B, we're replacing the entire world, right? But when you're actually getting down, getting your hands dirty, there are a lot of problems that people need to tackle, one by one. Like, for instance, how do you sell a product to non-technical people or non-AI people at all? Or how do you let them know that, okay, your agent identity is actually important, because if you lose access to your agent, if you don't care about the entire process, your agent might get hacked, or your agent might get polluted and it generates something else that you don't want. There are a lot of problems hanging in the air, and it's my pleasure to talk to both of you guys as the early builders and one of the most successful builders in the space. And hopefully our entire go-to-market strategy or co-selling strategy, and especially when we're talking to real customers, right, that is going to work in the future. And it's just a scaling problem, right? We found our beachhead market, and we just need to talk to more people and put our feet into their shoes and just start a transformation. Great to have you guys.